What if I told you that knitting is not good for you? That the hobby you enjoy so much is actually bad for your mental health? While it can be peaceful and even meditative, hardly anyone talks about the messy, frustrating, or downright unhealthy parts of knitting. So, whether you are a newbie or an experienced stitcher, here are 5 truths that might change the way you look at your favorite craft forever. I am knitting some socks here, just ribbing, stockinette stitch, and a plain vanilla pattern. Very calming, very relaxing. I don't really need to look at my knitting all the time. I'm sitting here in my studio / crafts room. So I ask you, what on earth could be wrong about this image? Isn't this, heaven? But that is only half of the story. What I'm not telling you is that I bought the yarn I'm using for these socks. These are the leftovers here, almost 5 years ago. And ever since that single skein, of course I only bought one skein, has been gathering dust in my stash along with 100 other similar skeins. And I bought it because it's a traceable single origin cordell yarn that is non-superwash and plastic free. It has been dyed using plant dyes instead of chemical acid dyes. And I paid $35 for the privilege of shopping 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, refreshing the browser like an idiot because the dyer only does very small batches and they literally sell out on the spot. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the only reason why I'm actually using it now, because that is a lot of money for a single skein of sheep wool where the heel will wear through faster than I can say hand wash only, lay flat to dry. $35, and now I'm knitting the most boring thing ever with it. Plain vanilla socks. That's the knitting equivalent of eating a banana, but you don't peel it like a sane person would, but you eat it with silver cutlery from a hand-painted porcelain dish. And if this had been a single occurrence, one could, brush it off and call it indulgence. Maybe it was my birthday. I actually treated myself with a couple of super expensive luxury skeins of vicuña yarn for my 40th birthday. Fair enough. But in knitting, overconsumption has become so common that terms like sable exist, stash acquired beyond lifetime expectancy, or that people joke that buying yarn and knitting are two separate hobbies. They joke about it. If you watch or listen to any knitting podcast, then there is typically a large section where people talk about all the yarn they have purchased, yarn you will typically never ever see again on the same podcast. People buy prohibitively expensive yarn advent calendars. What could be more romantic? $200, $300, $400, and then mid-January, the same people are desperately Googling for scrap yarn projects, and then those $300 mini skeins end up as dishcloths for $1 at the local charity shop. Now listen, I am not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do with your money and how or when you treat yourself. You are probably grown up, and if I look at the demographics here on my channel, probably for quite a couple of decades already. And if you simply want to cast on a pair of socks, it's nice to have a little variety at home, isn't it? But when they say knitting is healing, I do feel we need to talk about what you might be trying to gloss over with those huge shopping sprees. When you're feeling miserable, you might treat yourself with a nice glass of wine after a particularly stressful day. But if that becomes your go-to reaction after every minor little incident, well, you might want to start looking into fixing the problem rather than just treating the symptoms. And I'm not sure you should buy yarn to get validation either. I mean, sure, if you show your new sweater quantities of cashmere yarn at the local knitting meetup or post them online, you will be the center of attention for the next 15 minutes. And that feels nice, especially considering that the chances are high that very few people in your family actually care about your hobby, other than casually asking you to knit a huge project that takes you 60 hours to complete, and then they will screw it over after the first wash. I mean, that's kind of the realities of this hobby. So what I'm saying, validation can be a side product, but I'm not sure it should be your main motivation, and often it feels kind of that way on a subconscious level. And never forget that when influencers like myself show you yarn online, that's content for them. And that's how they make money. You don't. So yarn is squishy, soft, colorful, warm. It has all the components to bring you joy. But joy it should bring you, and I'm not sure it should be a coping mechanism. Of course, on the other side of the picture, there are people who pay a fortune for a car with I don't know how many horsepowers they will never need, or thousands for Pokemon cards. It's just printed cardboard. Or I believe my grandfather had 3 chainsaws, and the largest tree he ever felled with it was once a year our Christmas tree. That's about it. So from that perspective, most knitters are probably fine. And always consider you are not really hurting anyone with it. The only one you could hurt is yourself when you forget the knitting needle on the couch and you sit on it. That's painful, but it's not hurting anyone else. And I guess needles is a good cue because overconsumption does not only apply to yarn. Sticking with the aforementioned example, I'm knitting these socks here using needles where one set costs 65 US. And before you ask, yes, I have more than one set of these needles, and yes, I also own sterling silver needles. Does that make me a better knitter? Not at all. So for 8 centuries or more, we don't really know when knitting truly was invented, but probably somewhere in the 11th or 12th century in the Middle East. And that's why some people argue we are knitting from right to left, because that's how the Arabic writing system works. Anyway, for all these centuries, people have been using simple wires or bone needles, yet most of these ancient knitters would probably put any modern master knitter to shame despite using rather simple tools. Yet I know not only one knitter besides myself who owns the full range of all Knit Pro needles, or all Chagu sets, 4-inch tips, 5-inch tips, mini needles, bamboo, stainless steel, sharp tips, blunt tips. And I don't know about you, but I always buy the large set. Yet I almost never ever knit with needle sizes beyond 4 millimeters. Yet interchangeable knitting needles are so often recommended to beginners as their final salvation. Buy this set and you will never ever need to buy another knitting needle. Well, I don't know, for me that never worked out. Now I might be a special case because I have a full or 2 full drawers full of knitting needles, 10,000 knitting needles or so. Let's coin the term NABLE here. Needles acquired beyond lifetime expectancy. Healthy habit? Well, I have my doubts. A Chagu set costs upward of 150 US dollars, 150 US dollars for basically cheap trinkets full of nickel made in China under dubious working conditions that have a production value of maybe 10 US dollars, and that is already being very generous. And it's not like Haya also produced in China, or Knit Pro, their plant is in India, are any different. And Knit Pro produces about 90% of all the other brands who resell their products under different names like Knit Picks, Lana Grossa, Licker, and so on. That's all Knit Pro, all made in India. And it becomes a little bit more obvious if you take a look at the price of so a single pair of needles, a single pair of cables, or a single pair of cable connectors that sell for 9 US dollars for that much metal. And I guess that is one of the reasons why some people will defend and advertise these brands like they received money for it. Deep inside it, you know you are overpaying by a lot, and you kind of need to justify this bit of overconsumption in front of yourself and others. For a while, and until I blocked them, I had people from a Chagu Facebook group literally harassing me when I said one single bad word about the brand, like they were some saints that could do no wrong and they received money for it. Please know that the modern knitting industry is set up in a way that fosters overconsumption. Almost none of us these days knit because we need to. So for example, my grandmother literally had to knit all the sweaters of my uncles because she couldn't afford to buy them in a shop. Not that sweaters were available in those scarce times to begin with. Fast forward 60 or 70 years, and the idea of saving money by knitting your own sweaters will send any knitter into a laughing fit. And that's a good time to mention the old meme. Why buy it for $20 when you can buy craft supplies for $200 and make a sloppy version of it at home? And I think by realizing what is happening here, you can actually empower your craft. Once you realize that all these in the yarn dyer collection drops, these new sets of knitting needles, these mystery cowls, these sponsored reviews of yarn winders and whatnot solely exist to make you spend more money, you can kind of liberate yourself from it. Just like unraveling that old UFO unfinished object that has been lying around in your craft basket for 3 years or longer. You're not going to finish it. You know it, I know it, so unravel it. Liberate yourself from that burden. Every knitter probably intimately knows the feeling of just one more row, just one more row. Knitting is fun, but sometimes it's almost a little bit competitive, especially late at night. And you want to finish this section of the pattern, or you want to finish the project because maybe it's Christmas, maybe it's a birthday present, maybe it's a wedding shawl or something like that. So instead of taking a break, you continue to push through. And experienced knitters will be able to tell you that this is exactly the moment that mistakes happen most of the time. But that is actually not all. Often we learn knitting at a very young age, so when you're 15 or 20, your body is very, very forgiving. While an 8-hour knitting session might lead to some soreness, it will be gone the next day. If you're 50, 60 or 70, that will no longer be the case. If you overdo it, knitting can lead to permanent damage. Now, I have a full video on how to knit more ergonomically and another video on the best ergonomic knitting needles right here on YouTube. I'll add links to the description below. To me, it almost feels like 90% of all knitters aren't even aware that your overall posture is possibly even more important than the way you tension your yarn. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to educate yourself, especially in these days and ages where, well, it often feels like we spend half of our day looking at our mobile phone, holding it in our hand, bending our neck, which incidentally strains almost the exact same muscle groups as knitting. Think about it. The theory is, knitting is a hobby, and as I always say, you define what brings you joy and what doesn't. You learned it from your mother or your father, and one day you will hopefully teach it to your daughter or your son or your cousins. Now, let's set aside the fact that around 100 years ago, our Western society suddenly decided that knitting is only for women, and more than one generation forcefully told their young boys to stop the girlish hobby and rather do rugby or wrestle or something like that, even though it was mostly men who knit in the millennium prior to that. Now, even without that perverse twist, the reality often isn't all that romantic because enter the gatekeeping knitting bee. And I call them bees because every beehive will have those guards at the entrance that look for intruders. So for example, sometimes when you go to a local knitting meetup, you knitting with acrylic yarn might mean other people look down on you, and instead of shutting up, they go to great lengths explaining why they can't knit with acrylic yarn. Or you knit with a different knitting style and people will berate you how inefficient it is what you are doing, or downright wrong, and that they always do it like this and that they do it so much better, and then the conversation stops being about you and it's all about them. For me, actually, Ravelry is such a place. To me, it always felt like the communities and groups there speak an entirely different language, and I come from a different planet. It's just horrible for me. And here on my channel, I've seen countless comments where people said they dropped knitting altogether because they received too many negative comments, where people said, "You are a bad knitter." And then they only found the courage to come back to knitting decades later. How sad is that? If I am bad at knitting, that could be a problem if I want to teach you. But let me ask you, if you are bad at knitting, what will happen? Exactly nothing. So why waste your breath on berating others? Offer them kindness and encourage them. As humans, we thrive on positive feedback. That's all we can work with. So if you are stranded on a lone island and I tell you not to eat the red berries because they are poisonous, you still don't know which of the other 999 fruits you can eat. If I tell you, eat the bananas, they're good for you, you have a very clear path forward. Yet it's 2025 and some people still believe that sharing their straight and harsh critique without invitation would still benefit people, often arguing along the line, well, I would want to hear it as well, give it to me straight and clear. Well, maybe you do. But this isn't about you. To me, it always sounds a bit like those people saying that their parents or teacher beat them when they were young and that they didn't turn out all that bad either. Well, and here is another big issue. So, if you take a look at Ravelry or any pattern book or knitting magazine, most of them will almost exclusively feature young, Nordic-looking, slender females. And maybe there's one girl with slightly darker skin, but please not too dark. And please, no one with Asian features, because that doesn't spell diversity as loudly. And if you're lucky, there's one always middle-aged guy in there wearing, a brown, deep green or gray plain vanilla sweater. And maybe the sweater has 1 or 2 cables. Not more. That would be excessive. And I mean, in a way, it's understandable that men or trans people aren't that much represented in knitting catalogs and so on, because most knitters are female. However, I have been to my share of knitting meetups or festivals, and I can tell you that the majority of all knitters there is in the second half of their life, and most of them have actually long given up their hope to ever again fit into a size XS, not that they need to. And let's not get started on all those knitters who don't happen to have such a pale complexion as I do, and maybe a slightly darker skin tone. Yet when you open any pattern book or knitting catalog, it feels like 90% of all knitters aren't even represented there. I know for a fact that many of my fellow male knitters have totally given up knitting patterns because even if it says they're suitable for male, the fit turns out atrocious. And if I search for sweaters on Ravelry, this will be the result. And I ask you, wouldn't it be great to see one person that is not 20 or 30 in those results and not a size S or M? And maybe if there was an easy and accessible way to filter for images and patterns in those larger sizes. And then you often get to hear things like, well, men can also wear a pink crop top, or just use your fantasy if you want to knit it in a different color or a different size. Now, first of all, aphantasia, so the inability to form visual mental images, or color blindness, are very real things, and a large percentage of our society actually physically cannot just imagine a given pattern in a different color or size. And you also have to consider the following. Why does one group of knitters always have to use their fantasy and one never? And likewise, you can't just alter a pattern, setting aside that there comes a point where you've altered a pattern to a degree where your input outweighs the effort of the designer. A lot of people just don't know how to add bust darts or recalculate the decreases here for the recalculate the decreases so the fabric doesn't bunch out around the armpits. So I personally feel it's almost ironic that knitting, the hobby that is supposed to offer an alternative to fast fashion, falls almost into the same trap as designers only casting runway models for their shows. And I mean, it's been 3 decades since we noticed that that is not a healthy habit. Now, please don't get me wrong, I love knitting, and overall I also love the knitting community, where other content creators vigorously fight against hate comments and harassment. My subscribers have always treated me kindly. I get like 1 bad comment a month, and even that rarely involves, outright cursing and stuff like that, and insulting. And I largely attribute this to the fact that knitting is a hobby that forces you, through the long hours it requires to finish a project, it forces you to be content with yourself. And if you are content, if you are centered in yourself, there is no need to become a keyboard warrior and acquire social status through willy-nilly insulting people online to show how superior you are. So yes, I do believe that knitting is one of the best hobbies out there. Instead of doom scrolling, you are creating something useful. And if you are smart about it, it can even be a little bit more sustainable. For young children, learning a needlecraft can help them form vital neural connections, and they build important muscle memories that will be of use to them for the rest of their lives. Knitting can also offer access to amazing communities, online and offline. At our local knitting meetup, people in their 60s and 70s come, and the sister of my grandmother, she's in her late 90s, and still she goes to the Weaving Wednesday every Wednesday. So how amazing is that? And let's not forget that learning and educating yourself about new techniques, patterns, and products keeps your brain nimble, keeps it challenged, and current research points toward that being essential in the very last decades of your life. But let's not forget that overconsumption or gatekeeping are real problems that could potentially threaten the healthy bits of knitting. So over to you. What do you think about these issues? What can we do? Do we need to do anything, or did I miss something? Comment below and get the conversation started. And as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.